Walter Crane was born in Liverpool in 1845, the second son of Thomas Crane, a portrait painter and miniaturist, and Marie Crane, the daughter of a prosperous malt maker. Walter's brother, named Thomas after their father, would also become a successful illustrator, and arguably he was every bit as talented, although ultimately eclipsed by the greater fame of his brother. At the age of 14, Walter was apprenticed to the artist and wood engraver William James Linton, and he also studied at Heatherley School of Art in London. When he was still only 17, his oil painting The Lady of Shalott was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1862. And in 1863 he was one of several illustrators of the period commissioned to create drawings for the book Good Words, which were transcribed as engravings by the D.L. brothers, easily the most popular engravers of the era. And for someone so inexperienced, this was a very prestigious entrance into professional illustration. He continued to paint melodramatic subjects, but it was at this time that the well-established engraver and printer Edmund Evans employed Crane to illustrate a collection of children's books known as yellowbacks, a reference to their yellow enamelled covers. These proved to be very popular, and within only a couple of years they continued this successful collaboration with a wide range of titles, all published by the George Routledge Company. At this time, full-colour printing as we know it was not an option, but Crane and Evans worked together using a woodblock printing technique known as chromoxylography. The process was complicated and time-consuming, with as many as a dozen colour blocks needed to create a single image, which Crane drew directly onto the blocks. And although by contemporary standards they were fairly hit and miss in terms of registration, at the time they were considered a modern marvel by the public. These books sold for sixpence, which now translates as about £3.50 or $4, and coming at a time when literacy in working class children was very much on the rise, they sold in unprecedented numbers. Several were published in any given year, and the proceeds quickly made Evans and Crane wealthy men. One of the most skillfully and attractively printed of these books was 1869's Rhyming Alphabet book. The illustrations Crane created for this publication were also highly imaginative and succeeded in making education a fun activity, a principle which is now taken for granted in visual teaching aids. The decision to place the characters and letters on a black ground was also highly unusual in the Victorian era. In 1871, Crane married and toured Italy for the best part of 2 years with his new bride, but continued to work and posted his drawings to Edmund Evans, who transcribed them for reproduction until Crane's return. These books were now gathered under the banner Walter Crane's Toy Books, and all were rewrites of existing fairy tales, with the images dominant on the page layouts. The quality of both Crane's drawings and the colour printing had by now improved significantly, and although there have been quite a few other illustrated editions of these well-known tales and nursery rhymes, Crane's distinctive visualizations of them proved to be very popular. His illustrative approach continued to be conspicuously formal in composition and execution, and it was his belief that children had little interest in three-dimensional renders or true perspective. By this point, Crane's books were being published by several different publishers, and as the 1870s progressed, some were being published as more expensive, better-bound hardback editions. And in addition to his book illustration and ongoing production of painted art, Crane also began branching out into domestic decoration and fabric design, with increasing popularity among the more affluent and style-conscious in British society. But the books just kept on coming, and in 1877 The Baby's Opera, a collection of English nursery songs, was published. The use of the word baby in the title was somewhat misleading, as it was manifestly aimed at children old enough to be able to read and understand the verses. But nevertheless it was immensely successful, and had to be reprinted several times to meet the unprecedented demand. And in order to further capitalise on this success, the following year saw the publication of another similar collection, this time titled The Baby's Bouquet, and it proved to be every bit as successful with the public as the previous year's offering. In 1979, Crane illustrated the household stories of the Brothers Grimm, translated from the German by his sister Lucy. It was an exclusively monochrome volume, and the illustrations were engraved from Crane's drawings by Joseph Swain, giving the whole book a distinctively and appropriately medieval feel. Although it was just one of many other visualizations of these remarkably enduring and frequently gothic nightmarish stories, this one proved to be significantly popular and was reprinted numerous times well into the 20th century. As the 1880s rolled around, all the various strands of his output continued to flourish, with more paintings in oils and watercolours and evidence of increasing diversity in the outcomes he was producing, which now included magazine work, greetings cards, and even occasional advertising commissions, although this would always remain of peripheral interest to him. In 1883 he illustrated the book Panpipes, another collection of lyrics and music for traditional English songs. And as with much of his work, it wasn't just the colour illustrations themselves he created, but also the page layouts, decoration and hand lettering, giving particular cohesion to this and any other project he tackled. From the early 1880s, Crane was also closely aligned with the growing socialist movement in Britain. As such, he was keen to do what he could to bring art and design into the daily life of the working classes, and with that ideal in mind, he produced many designs for fabric and wallpaper patterns. How affordable these would have actually been, I've been unable to find out, but I suspect they may well have been out of the reach or aspirations of those at the bottom of the social ladder in Britain at the time. It was during the 1880s that Crane illustrated numerous books for children written by Mary Louisa Molesworth, who wrote as Mrs. Molesworth. His work for all these books, which spanned more than a decade, was created as pen and ink and engraved by Joseph Swain. And even without the benefit of colour, the images added greatly to the sentimental appeal of these narratives. In 1887, the children's book Legends for Lionel was published, and it was both written and illustrated by Crane. The Lionel in question was one of his own children, and it revealed a more than usual level of agreeable absurdity, more in keeping with the earlier nonsense verse and imagery of Edward Lear. And it was equally unusual in that it was not created by wood engraving or woodblock printing, but as watercolour illustrations which were printed chromolithographically. And it was also in that year that he returned to his oddly named Baby series with Baby's Own Aesop, his illustrated and highly decorated visualisation of the timeless fables. It was also a return to the woodblock process used on his earlier books, indicating a certain reluctance on his part to fully embrace the changing technology of print. He also wrote the texts in verse and hand-lettered them incorporated into the overall layout, with considerable appeal and visual absorption, and every page was a real visual delight for the young readers. Flora's Feast, A Mask of Flowers, followed in 1889, and like the earlier Legends of Lionel book, it was another created in line and wash. This difference in execution undoubtedly brought out a more gestural quality in Crane's work, even if it wasn't a major deviation from his woodblock images. But what was distinctly different in these floral fantasies was the simplicity and absence of decoration around the image. Crane continued to enjoy success in all his other endeavours, and as well as more magazine and journal design, he persisted with occasional examples of more advertising work. And by this point his domestic designs were including the production of pottery. There was also a series of book covers for melodramatic romance novels aimed at female adult readers, and evidence of theatrical costume design, another of his occasional forays into relatively unexpected creative arenas. He remained true to his political beliefs, and in that capacity he provided a large volume of rather heavy-handed cartoons, many of which were later published as one volume in Cartoons for the Cause. He was also president of the Healthy and Artistic Dress Union, and produced literature such as the unintentionally comic How to Dress Without a Corset. Crane was an admirer and friend of William Morris, the respected progenitor of the arts and crafts movement, who also shared Crane's socialist ideology. But it seems the only time they collaborated was on a remarkably medievalist-styled romantic fantasy, The Story of the Glittering Plain, published by Morris's Kelmscott Press in 1891. It was also in 1891 that Crane visited the United States to preside over an exhibition of his work, but neither he nor his work were well received and his stay was only brief. But in the same year he had 2 books of his own illustrated poems published in Britain. Queen's Summer saw a return of the woodblock technique and more florid verse from Crane, incorporated artfully into the page design and figure work. Renaissance was published entirely in black and white from his pen drawings, as small illuminated headings for each poem. In 1892, Crane's illustrated edition of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Wonder Book for Girls and Boys, originally written in 1851, was also published. This edition featured more ink and watercolour illustrations printed chromolithographically, and were as near to the painted originals as the technology was capable of at the time. The somewhat vague title concealed the fact that Hawthorne's book consisted of the retelling of 6 Greek legends, and Crane's visualizations brought them to vivid life for the young readers, even though his posing and composition continued to be quite mannered and formal. If anything, his involvement in left-leaning politics, or at least the creation of suitably supportive graphics, grew in intensity at this time, although his ideals didn't prevent him from creating this poster for French champagne for an altogether different demographic at the same time. In 1896, Crane produced illustrations for Edmund Spenser's 16th century epic poem The Fairy Queen. They were a return to his deliberately backward-looking heavy monochrome style, and all the illustrations were elaborately bordered with a range of decorative motifs which added greatly to the book's character. There were also some examples of stained glass work designed by him at this time, but it doesn't seem to have been a particularly enduring aspect of his output. In further demonstration of his socialism, Crane was still producing a considerable amount of illustration aimed at the less well-off, and in 1898 he created the first of what will be a decade-long run of educational books teaching the principles of English grammar, written by Nellie Dale. By this point he had a deservedly good reputation in other European countries, and in 1898 he was one of very few non-Germans to produce an illustrated cover for the arts magazine Jugend. In 1899, a floral fantasy in an old English garden, yet another amalgamation of Crane's own poetry and illustration, was created using woodblock printing, but with a far lighter touch than seen previously, an effect greatly enhanced by the choice of reddish-brown rather than black outline. As the 20th century began, he published a retelling of Don Quixote for children, not that the original had what might be called particularly adult content, but the text was much simplified to reflect the age of the intended readers. This edition was a highly appealing but determinedly traditional publication, with some small format monochrome chapter headings, and a collection of colour pages which were again reproduced as remarkably complex woodblocks, despite the rapidly growing move to the use of full-colour offset lithographic printing seen in many other illustrated books by this time. Art continued to be a strong element of his output, and his oil paintings and watercolours were regularly shown at exhibitions in prestigious London galleries. And his domestic design work in both 2 and 3 dimensions remained as popular as ever with the middle classes and the decoration of their homes. In 1905, Crane published A Flower Wedding, featuring a return to the creation of suitably dainty pen and watercolour images, which were essentially character studies set against the empty page, all making frivolous mileage from his floral theme. He stuck with this formula for the following year's very similar Flowers from Shakespeare's Garden, and both books clearly showed that when working in colour, he had now finally bowed to the inevitability of progress and joined the ranks of others already using this technique, but who were arguably doing so with greater accomplishment. In 1907, he published the book The Child's Socialist Reader, a collection of pictures and text using clumsy propagandist narratives. And I suspect far more working-class kids of the period were far too busy reading comics to be all that interested. By this point, many of his earlier works were still being reprinted and repackaged decades after they had first been published, but he continued to add to this large accumulation of books with a couple more. In 1911, he produced a rousing colour edition of Henry Gilbert's King Arthur's Knights, and the images he rendered in ink and wash exhibited a far more solid and convincing application than previous ventures into full colour. This was very much to their benefit, and his work for this book, although late in his career, did show a willingness to adapt to the new print process, or at least an acceptance of its potential. And this was also true of the same year's tale of another enduring British legend, Robin Hood, which followed the identical methods, combining ink line and colour wash with great romantic plausibility and pictorial appeal. But these would be his last published illustrations, and a fitting swan song for a man who had dominated British illustration for the best part of half a century. And Walter Crane died in 1915 in Horsham, at the age of 70, just 3 months after the death of his wife Mary. Crane was undoubtedly a significant figure in the evolution of children's illustration, and if his work now seems too mannered and rigidly structured for modern tastes, and certainly my own, that shouldn't detract from his vital role in the transition from the limitations of the Victorian era into the greater stylistic freedoms of the 20th century.